Jenny. When I was 4 years old, my mom and I moved into a large colonial house that was built in the late 1800s. My mom always had a weird feeling about the house. There was a little bricked off section in the basement and we never knew why it was there. My mother told me that soon after we moved into the house, I suddenly had an imaginary friend. One day, out of the blue, I told her that I had been playing with a little girl named Jenny. She thought that it was just a phase and didn't pay much attention to it. I told her that Jenny wanted me to let the cat go down into the basement so that she could play with it. My mother allowed me to let the cat go down there. It never came back. That creeped her out. Then, a few days later, I told her Jenny wanted me to go down into the basement to play with her. My mother refused and told me to go upstairs to bed. I did, and when I woke up the next morning, I had deep scratches on my back and legs. My mom decided to research the history of the house. She found an old picture of the house and the family who used to live there. She showed me the picture and asked if I recognized any of them. There were 7 little girls in the picture and, without hesitation, I pointed to one of them. The names of all the family members were written on the back. The girl I had pointed to was named Jenny. My mother got scared, because during her research, she had discovered that the girl named Jenny had gone down into the basement one day and was never seen again. The family never found her and they moved shortly after that. After I identified the girl in the picture, it was all way too much for my mom to handle. We moved out of the house and found somewhere else to live. When I turned 18, Ma told me all about what had happened in that house. It still scares me when I think about it. Second story. Don't tell anyone my name. My niece had an imaginary friend, but she said she wasn't allowed to tell anyone his name. She said he told her everyone would get scared if they knew it. We kept asking her, but she would never tell anyone the name. Then one day, her mom and I were in the hallway and my niece didn't realize it. She was talking to her imaginary friend and called him by his name. To this day, whenever I think about it, I am still creeped out. The imaginary friend's name was Lucifer. Funny faces. I was staying in my aunt's house when I saw my 4-year-old cousin, April, sitting on the stairs. She was making funny faces. I asked her what she was doing and she said, "I'm copying the lady with the braid." There was no one else there, so I asked, "Where is the lady, April?" She pointed up at a beam running parallel to the stairwell. "And what is the lady doing?" I asked. "Making funny faces," April replied. I was about to go upstairs when April said something that stopped me in my tracks. "Her braid is around her neck." I asked her what she meant. April pointed up and said, "The lady is hanging by her braid. She's making funny faces at me." Then April started making a face. Her eyes were wide and bugged out. Her mouth hung open and her tongue stuck out. I realized it was the face of someone who was strangling to death. Matt. When I was growing up, there was a girl in my neighborhood who very weird. All of the other kids were freaked out by her. One day, she told all of the kids that, in the forest behind her house, there were dead, bloody people. When they heard this, all of the kids freaked out and told their parents. Their fathers had to go out and search the forest, just in case. All they found was candy wrappers and empty beer bottles. After that, all of the kids in the neighborhood refused to go near her, including me. A few years later, my parents divorced. On the day the moving came to take my mom's things out of the house, the girl came out of nowhere and told me that Matt didn't like that my parents were getting a divorce. I had no idea who Matt was. Even though I stopped being friends with her, my dad was still friends with her parents. My dad told me that Matt was her imaginary friend. Her parents had told him all about the problems they were having. Matt was often too physical. They claimed that Matt could control the lights and could even make the power go out. They said Matt also knocked on doors at night. If he was ignored, the banging on the doors would start. A few years later, my dad decided that he would invite the girl and her parents over to our house. I was begging my dad not to do this, but he said it would be nice to catch up with them. When they came over that night, my dad told me to entertain the girl. I brought her up to my bedroom and she seemed to be acting normal. She even told me how nice my room was. However, I was still creeped out by her. She just sat down in the middle of the floor while I tried to put a movie on the DVD player. All of a sudden, out of nowhere, in the most deadpan voice, she said, "Matt's here." At that exact moment, the lights began to flicker on and off. I got so scared, I ran out of my room, crying in fear. Her parents came running up the stairs, dragged their daughter out of my room and took her home. For weeks afterwards, I refused to sleep in my bedroom. I haven't heard much from that family ever since then. I heard that Matt still controlled the lights, but I don't know if he is still around. To this day, whenever the lights begin flickering or a bulb blows, it still freaks me out. The dead boy. My boyfriend is a homicide detective, and a couple of years ago, he was investigating the murder of a little boy. They still hadn't found the body. The mother of the little boy broke down and admitted she had killed him and hid his body under their old trailer. When the police went out to search the trailer, they found there was a new family living in it. The family said their son had an imaginary friend who lived under the trailer and would come up to see him. The cops found the body of the dead boy just under his room. Kelly. When my daughter was 3, she had an imaginary friend named Kelly who lived in her closet. She said Kelly played with her and sat in a little rocking chair while she slept. 2 years later, we were watching a horror movie and my daughter said, "That looks like Kelly." "Kelly who?" I asked. "You know, Kelly," she replied, "the dead girl that lived in my closet." The little girl in the lake. When I was a kid, we often went camping on Lake Daring in New Hampshire. One day, when I was 6 years old, I fell off of the dock and plunged into the water. I couldn't swim. While I was underwater, I distinctly remember seeing a little girl down there who told me to look up towards the sun and just keep kicking and I'd be fine. I swam to the surface just in time for my grandfather to grab me and pull me back on the dock. I found out later that a little girl had drowned in that lake near that very same spot. Jessica. When I was just a baby, my older sister Julia had an imaginary friend named Jessica. She said when Jessica got mad, her eyes turned green and her voice grew deeper. She was Julia's friend for a long time, but then things started to get a little weird. After a while, my parents began to believe that our house was haunted. One night, my mom was putting me to bed and I began to cry and point at the corner. My mom tried to comfort me, but I kept crying and pointing at the same corner. All of a sudden, my sister walked into the room, pointed at the corner and yelled, "Jessica! Stop it!" I immediately stopped crying and Julia said, "Sometimes Jessica likes to put on scary masks and scare people." My mom was a little freaked out and said, "Tell Jessica that if she can't play nice, she can't play here at all." Eventually, my sister Julia outgrew her imaginary friend and stopped mentioning her. A few years later, my little sister Abby began to talk. She told my mom she had a friend that no one else could see. She said her imaginary friend's eyes turned green when she was upset. My mother asked her what her imaginary friend's name was and she replied, "Jessica." Scotty. Back when I was in elementary school, my best friend's name was Ryan. We were around 6 or 7. One day, there was a new kid in our class. His name was Andrew and he had just moved in from out of state. He was socially awkward and used to sit alone, just talking quietly to himself. The strange thing was, he always appeared to be enraged during these conversations with himself. Ryan and I decided to befriend him and he invited us over to his house for a sleepover. The whole day went by without incident and it was all good fun. Andrew seemed different at home. He was more relaxed, more comfortable, more normal. That night, we went to sleep in his bedroom which was in the basement. I remember lying there on the floor. My buddy Ryan was asleep near me and Andrew was across the room on a couch. It was dark and I could only see his outline. All of a sudden, Andrew started making some eerie high-pitched noises. It sounded like a steaming tea kettle. Then he stood up, still letting out that high-pitched screeching noise, and I saw him walking towards me. I kicked Ryan to wake him up and both of us were freaking out. Andrew kept walking until he was standing over us. Then, he just kneeled down and slowly let the screech die out. Ryan and I looked at each other, unsure about what to do. Suddenly, Andrew grabbed our arms and started squeezing like he was trying to crush them. In a disturbing low voice, he growled, "Scotty wants you both to leave." I ripped my arm out of his grasp and so did Ryan. Andrew got up again and just stood there staring at us, letting out a high-pitched evil laugh. We both got up and I suggested going to Andrew's mom's room to wake her up. Before we took a step, Andrew just started screaming at the top of his lungs. His mom came sprinting down the stairs and turned all of the lights on. We saw that Andrew had scratches up and down his arms and his face looked deathly pale. His mom laid him on the ground and held him down. She was trying to speak over his screams and she was saying things like, "Andy. Andy. It's okay. Scotty isn't real, Andy." She turned to us and told us to go upstairs and put our coats on. She was going to take us home. For a couple of weeks after that, we didn't talk to Andrew at school. Eventually, we asked him about it and he said, "It's okay now. You won't see Scotty anymore. No one will." Needless to say, that was the end of that and we never talked to him again. He ended up getting removed from my school because he attacked a kid with a tree branch at recess. George. We were watching a scary movie when my nephew looked up and said, "What's George doing on TV?" I asked him what he meant and he said, "That boy on TV looks like George." I asked him who George was and he replied, "He lives above my bed every night when the lights are off and talks to me but I can't hear him." I asked him to draw me a picture. He drew a small boy with black holes for eyes and no teeth who was bleeding from his neck. "That's George," he said. Tuna. My little brother had an imaginary friend named Tuna. He said she was the size of a thimble. When he stopped mentioning her, we asked him what had happened to her. He said he ate her. The evil. My daughter had some imaginary friends for a couple years named Dodo, Ghana and the Evil. They just sort of appeared out of nowhere when she was almost 3 years old. It started with Dodo and Ghana. Then a few months later she came up to me with a creepy, expressionless face, told me, "The evil is coming over today," and just walked away. It turned out that the evil was actually a nice imaginary friend. She just had an unfortunate name. One nights with Mori. My aunt and uncle moved into a new house. I was staying with them for a week, but I got a weird vibe about their house. I was sleeping in the attic and, around 3 a.m., I woke up to find my 6-year-old cousin standing next to my bed. He started telling me about his imaginary friend, Mori. The next day, when I asked his parents about it, they told me he didn't have an imaginary friend when they lived in their previous house. They decided to ask him about it, but he said he had no idea what they were talking about. The next night, around 3 a.m., I woke up again to find my little cousin staring at me. He kept repeating over and over, "Why'd you tell? Why'd you tell? Why'd you tell?" I tried to talk to him and he started telling me about how Mori would appear in his dreams at night and eat dinner with the family when they were at the table. I asked him how he met Mori and he told me that Mori came to him and asked him if he could come inside him. He said, "Yeah, sure, come on in." That's when Mori started come to his bedside every night and talk to him. The next day, I told his parents but they didn't believe me. They thought I was making it up. On my final night in the house, I was awoken by a faint thumping under my bed. At this point, I was very scared, but I worked up the courage to peek under my bed. I found my little cousin hiding under there. "I'm protecting you from Mori," he said. "He can't trust you and he needs you gone. Mori won't hurt you if I protect you." Those were the last words I heard him say. I ran faster than I ever have before and made it at least 3 blocks down the road before my aunt and uncle caught up with me and begged me to stop. They asked me what had happened and when I told them, they didn't believe me. When we walked back to the house and went upstairs, my cousin was in his bed, sound asleep. I left the next morning and never went back. To Jacob the lumberjack. I was looking after a 5-year-old boy and he told me that a man named Jacob, who was dressed like a lumberjack, was sitting next to me on the couch. He must have seen the look of shock on my face and said, "Don't worry. He doesn't have arms." 3. Sally the murderer. My daughter had an imaginary friend named Sally. She once told me about how Sally was in jail for chopping her mom's head off. 4. The creeper man. From the age of 3, my son always told me about the creeper man, who lives in my mom and dad's bedroom. He brings it up after he visits them. I made the mistake once of asking what the man looks like. My son said, "Oh, he doesn't have a face." 5. Emily. When my sister was 6 or 7, she had an imaginary friend named Emily. She told us Emily was the same age as her, lived in her closet, wore an old black dress and had long dark hair. My sister played with Emily constantly and my parents started noticing she was acting weird. She was very distant and just sat in the middle of her room whispering to Emily. One day, my brother was walking by and my sister was sitting in the middle of her room. She suddenly turned around and hissed at him. It scared because she didn't even look like our sister. My parents ran up to her room and I could hear my sister screaming and screaming, "Get out! Get out!" as loud as she could. I have no idea what happened in that room, but when the screaming stopped, I saw my parents holding my sister and they were crying their eyes out. She was sobbing as well. Years later, I asked her about it and she told me that Emily used to tell her to do horrible things to herself. She actually used to wake up on the roof and couldn't remember how she got there. Apparently Emily absolutely hated our parents, so she tried to turn my sister against them. When we moved into a different house, Emily was gone. I'm just relieved we left that house. 6. The blurry people. When I was a kid, I had several imaginary friends and they would always surround me and look down on me. I'll always remember what they looked like. They didn't have any sort of distinguished features, but rather they were just shadowy silhouettes. They rarely spoke to me, but my mom told me that when I was alone in my room, I would have lengthy conversations with what seemed like a bunch of people. They were always just sort of there. 7. The captain. A mother told me that she was concerned because her son talked about a ghost who would talk to him and play with him in his room. He said the ghost was called the captain and he was an old man with a beard. He said the captain told him when he grows up his job will be to kill people, and the captain would tell him who needed to be killed. The kid would cry and say he doesn't want to be a killer, but the captain told him he didn't have a choice and he would get used to killing after a while. The boy also told a girl in his class, "I know where you live, and you might be good at hiding, but I'll still find you." 8. The evil rabbit. When my cousin was 5, she had a stuffed rabbit that she carried everywhere with her. She even talked to it. One day, while I was watching her, she was sleeping on the couch. Suddenly, she woke up and started shouting at her rabbit for no reason. She was yelling over and over, "No! You can't do that. That's bad. Don't do it." I asked her what was wrong, but she wouldn't listen to me. I finally had to take the rabbit up to her room, and when I came back down she was asleep on the couch again. I have no idea what that rabbit was planning to do. 9. Roger. My little brother had an imaginary friend named Roger who lived under our coffee table. He said Roger had a wife and 9 kids. Roger and his family lived peacefully under our coffee table for 3 years. Then, one day, my little brother announced that Roger wouldn't be around anymore. When we asked him why, he told us he shot and killed Roger and his whole family. I don't know if he remembers any of this today, but his genuine lack of remorse was very disturbing. 10. The Easter Bunny. When I was 16, I had to babysit for twin boys who were in the 3rd grade at the time. They always spoke about a man in an Easter bunny costume, and they were terrified of him. One day I was babysitting, and one twin was in the shower. His brother and I were sitting downstairs watching TV when all of a sudden, he said, "You need to go check on Matt." Seconds later, we heard Matt yelling from upstairs, "He's in here. He's in here." I ran upstairs, and I had to check every room before he would calm down. I'm not sure which part of the experience freaked me out the most. 11. Shaggy. When my mom was young, she had an imaginary friend named Shaggy. When she got a little older, she told her mother she was finished with Shaggy, so she got rid of him. My grandmother asked her what she meant and she said, "I chopped him up and put him in the fridge." 12. I can't kill him. When my brother was little, He acted like he had imaginary friends who were talking to him every second. One day, my mom overheard him say, "I can't kill him. He's my only dad." 13 Car crash. When I was little, I had a whole gang of imaginary friends. One day my mum noticed I hadn't talked about them in a while and asked me what happened to them. I calmly told her that they had all died in a car crash. Dasaga. My sister got married when she was 18. She had a daughter named Susie. Her husband was unemployed. She had to work 2 jobs to support herself, her daughter and her lazy husband. Every day, she left the house at 8 a.m. and she only returned home at 8 p.m. every night. Around this time, Susie had an imaginary friend. She told my sister it was a little girl named Dasaga. Susie would talk about Dasaga all the time. My sister even overheard her talking to Dasaga. It creeped her out, and after a while, she told Susie she was forbidden to talk about Dasaga. We weren't allowed to mention Dasaga when we came over to visit. One day, Susie told her mom, "Dasaga is mad at you because you don't believe she's real. She comes to play with me when Daddy closes the closet door after you leave and he lets us out before you come home." My sister had no idea this was happening. Her husband was supposed to be watching Susie during the day. Instead, he would lock her in a closet with a box of cereal and leave her there all day. When my sister discovered what was going on, she kicked her husband out. Creepy, right? The poor little girl spent so much time all alone, locked in a closet, that she had conjured up an imaginary playmate for herself. But wait for it. Here comes the really creepy part. My sister divorced her husband and got custody of Susie. She decided to move out of the house they were renting. When the moving van came, the old man who owned the house came over to help them. He was talking to my sister and said, "I was always worried about your little girl on those basement stairs. My little granddaughter fell down those basement stairs and broke her neck. She died in front of that closet door down there." When she heard that, my sister got the chills. "What was her name?" she asked. "It wasn't Dasaga, was it?" The old man looked at her and said, "Her name was Jessica. She was only 4 years old. She couldn't say it properly." "How did you know that's how she said her name?" "Dasaga. How did you know?" My sister was in denial. She told him she didn't know what he was talking about. She refused to talk about it, grabbed the last of her things and left the house for good. Even today, we're still not allowed to talk about Susie and her imaginary friend, Dasaga. My sister remarried a few years later. Susie got a great new stepdad and, so far, they've lived happily ever after. They were both dead. I used to babysit a kid who had 2 imaginary friends. He told me they were both dead. One was an old lady and the other had no head. They were both covered in blood. The one with no head had his insides sticking out of his neck. After he told me that, I didn't ask him any more questions. Icy wants me to tell you. My best friend had a little sister who was 5 or 6 years old. She had an imaginary friend named Icy. One day, I was waiting for him to come downstairs when his sister came up to me and said, "Icy told me to ask you if you know when you're going to die." I laughed nervously, but I played along. "No, of course not," I said. "No one knows that. Hopefully I won't die until I'm very old." The little girl shook her head sadly and said, "No, Icy wants me to tell you it'll be tonight." And with that, she just walked away. Jinn. My parents told me that, when I was about 3 or 4, I had an imaginary friend named Jinn. Apparently, I told them she was an old lady and she lived in our backyard. My parents said I talked about her all the time and I warned them not to let her inside the house. My parents were so freaked out by it that they went to a Christian pastor for advice. He told them the name sounded familiar and said he would do some research on it. He mentioned it to a Muslim friend of his who told him that, in Islamic belief, a jinn is a demon that attaches itself to people or inanimate objects. As it turns out, my grandfather had brought home a hand-carved table from Saudi Arabia during one of his military tours and he had given it to my parents as a present. They left it outside on the garden patio. My dad wanted to get rid of it. He was going to sell it, but the pastor told him to burn it. He did and I never saw or talked about the old lady again. They won't be laughing. When I was young, I moved to a new country. Since I didn't have any real friends, I made up imaginary friends. I was always afraid of being rejected or laughed at. I had this belief that all the people that were mean to me would go to hell and burn. One day, my parents were out and my grandmother made me dinner. She didn't know about my imaginary friends. I looked at the empty chair beside me and said, "Hey, aren't you hungry? Eat up." They might be laughing now, but they won't be laughing once they're all on fire. My grandmother gave me a weird look and for a whole year afterwards, she tried to tell my mom that I was possessed by the devil. Spooky guy. As a kid, I had an imaginary friend who was a ghost. I called him Spooky Guy and told my mother he died in the garage of the house on the hill behind ours. I said he was a 16-year-old boy who got into a car crash. He walked to that house and asked to use their phone. The person who lived there grabbed him and killed him in the garage. This scared my mom so much that she tried to look up records to see if that actually happened and got me a therapist. It is the punishment. A friend of the family asked me to babysit their 6-year-old son. I put him to bed and a couple of hours later, I decided to peek in to check on him. When I opened the door, I saw he was standing in the corner, facing the wall. It was one of the creepiest things I've ever seen. I asked him what he was doing and all he did was turn around and put his finger to his lips as if to say, "Shush." I asked him again what he was doing and all he said was, "Leave us." It is the punishment. Bejeba. When my cousin was little, he had an imaginary friend. He called him Bejeba. He claimed that Bejeba was a monster and sometimes he would tell him to do bad things. After a few weeks of this, his mother told him never to talk about Bejeba again. Apparently, the name my cousin was trying to pronounce was Beelzebub. Andy. I live in an old 3-story house with a hidden attic. This attic room always had a creepy vibe. The only way to get into the attic was through a hidden panel in the ceiling. You had to push it and a set of retractable stairs would come down. One day, my sister came to visit and she brought my nephew with her. He was 5 years old and it was the first time he had been in the house. There was a group of us in the house. We had dinner and afterwards, we stayed in the kitchen talking. Then we suddenly realized that my nephew was nowhere to be seen. We started calling out his name and searching frantically for him. There were 9 people running around the house, shouting his name and around looking for him. I checked the street outside, the garage, the downstairs, the upstairs. There was no trace of him. It was as if he had disappeared. We were about to call the police and I was standing in the upstairs hallway. Just then, the panel in the ceiling above me opened and I saw my little nephew. He had a blank look on his face and no emotion in his eyes. I pulled the retractable stairs down and brought him down. "How did you get up there?" I said. "Why didn't you answer when we were calling you?" The kid looked me straight in the eye and said, "I was just playing with Andy up there." He showed me the stairs and told me to be quiet because we were playing hide and seek. There was no way he could have known about the hidden attic and there was no way he could have reached the panel to pull down the stairs. Ever since then, I have avoided that attic room. Red glowing eyes. When my son was 4 years old, he told me he had an imaginary friend who would sit in the corner in the dark and light up the room with his red, glowing eyes. Facey. When I was 3 years old, I had an imaginary friend named Facey. Whenever I drew pictures of her, she never had a face. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. My mom asked me why she didn't have any facial features and I said, she isn't living anymore so she isn't allowed to have a face. Barrett. The other night, I was at dinner with my parents. We were talking about the house I grew up in. I happened to mention how much I loved that house and that I remembered playing with a boy who lived next door. His name was Barrett and he taught me how to play jacks. My parents told me that the house next door was vacant and Barrett was the name of my imaginary friend. I thought he was real creepy. Harold. I had an imaginary friend when I was 5. At night, he would sit at the edge of my bed, talking to me for hours. One night, my mother walked in and saw me sitting up in bed, whispering to someone. She asked who I was talking to and I nonchalantly said, "Harold." She freaked out and took me to her bedroom where she cuddled me. She was shaking and her face was pale. Apparently, Harold was the name of my stepfather's uncle and he had died in that room several years before. I had no reason to know anything about him. She told me I described him exactly. I always did have weird dreams when I stayed in that bedroom. Elizabeth. When I was a little boy, we lived in the middle of nowhere. Houses were few and far between. Whenever my parents took me to visit my grandma, we had to pass a small house that was down an old dirt road. Every time we passed this house, I would tell my parents, "That's where my sister lives." I didn't have a sister. I was an only child. After hearing this so many times, my parents finally asked me what my sister's name was. I told them her name was Elizabeth. My parents laughed it off, until one day my mother got curious, decided to find out who lived in the house. She discovered that, many years before, there was a little girl who had lived in that house and she died when she was very young. Her name was Elizabeth. Carson. When I was about 4 or 5 years old, I had an imaginary friend. She had freckles, long curly hair and pale blue-green eyes. I didn't talk to her or acknowledge her, but she was always just there. One day, I got curious and asked her what her name was. She said, "Carson." I said okay and she went away. I never recall seeing her again. Years later, when I was grown up, my mom decided I was old enough to know something. She said that, before I was born, she had another baby, but it died after 4 hours. The baby's name was Carson.